Thanks, Sean. As I'm sure Michael Palin would have got that. Today we find him in North America to present to us the red-eyed vireo in Tweet of the Day.
In a woodland glade in New York State, a red-eyed vireo seems to be posing and answering an unending flow of inquisitive questions. Red-eyed vireos are about the size of British great tits and common summer visitors to much of North America. The adult vireos are mainly olive green with white bellies and grey heads, with red eyes highlighted by a white eye stripe. Seeing the birds as they hunt insects among the leaves is much harder than hearing them. Because of their long, persistent singing, with few pauses, red-eyed vireos used to be known locally as preacher birds. Territorial males hold the record for the largest repertoire produced by a songbird in a single day. One bird in Canada produced 22,197 song phrases over 14 hours and sang continuously for 10 hours. While these marathon question and answer sessions are the soundtrack to many North American woods, they aren't universally appreciated. The American nature writer Bradford Torrey wrote in 1889 that whoever dubbed this vireo the preacher should have had no very exalted opinion of the clergy.
Good morning, it's 6 o'clock on Thursday the 19th of May. This is Today with Justin Webb in Glasgow and Simon Jack in London.
The headlines this morning: business leaders are urging the government to act now to protect the economy and to ease the impact of rising costs, saying the autumn budget will be too late. We will hear during the course of the programme from the CBI, the TUC and from a range of voices, including Sir Martin Sorrell.
I think the simple message is the sooner the better.
The UN Secretary-General has warned that the war in Ukraine is increasing the risk of global food shortages and mass hunger. And also in today's programme, why boys and young men are increasingly affected by eating disorders. Here in Glasgow, we hear from fans disappointed at Rangers' loss last night.
Not the result that we were looking for, however, we've had a fantastic day supporting our team. And we love Glasgow Rangers, but we've supported them through and through, and you know, it's great for them to get to where they have been.
Plus, working from home, is it the new front in the culture wars? If a person reveals their Brexit view, their thoughts on race or sex, will it be obvious that they think we should all work at home or go to the office? The BBC News is read this morning by Chris Aldridge.
Business leaders have warned that the government needs to take further action immediately to safeguard the UK's economy and tackle the rising cost of living. During a speech to the CBI in London last night, the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, acknowledged that conditions were challenging and said he was working on a plan. But his comments were met with frustration. Simon Jack was there.
On one thing, the Chancellor and business leaders agreed. The economy is taking a major turn for the worse. Rishi Sunak conceded things were going to be tough in the months ahead. And the President of the CBI, Lord Karan Bellamoria, said firms were worried about stalling growth, rampant inflation and high taxes. But while the Chancellor said his response to the cost of living crisis and a stalling economy would evolve, business leaders said waiting for an autumn budget would be too late. With business and consumer confidence evaporating fast, their message was, if you're going to do something, do it now.
Ministers are being urged to bring forward increases in benefits payments to help people struggling with rising costs. Under the current system, rises each April are pegged to the rate of inflation the previous September. Here's our personal finance correspondent, Kevin Peachy.
6 weeks ago, benefits and the state pension rose by 3.1%. Prices are now increasing at 9% annually and are expected to accelerate further. That will be reflected in the uprating of benefits and pension payments in April next year. Charities and leading think tanks, including the Institute for Fiscal Studies, say at least part of those higher payments should be made earlier. But the Treasury says the complexity of the welfare system means there are technical restraints to such a move.
The UN Secretary-General has warned that the war in Ukraine is increasing the risk of a global food shortage unless Russia releases grain stored in Ukrainian ports. Antonio Guterres told a summit in New York that the conflict could lead to years of mass hunger and even famine for millions of people in poorer countries. The American Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, urged the international community to do more.
There are an estimated 22 million tons of grain sitting in silos in Ukraine right now. Food that could immediately go toward helping those in need if it can simply get out of the country. Countries with significant grain and fertilizer reserves, as well as those with financial resources, need to step up and do it fast.
The British Medical Association has accused the government of failing in its duty of care to doctors and other healthcare professionals in its handling of the pandemic. The Doctors' Trade Union asked its members for their views on the response of ministers to COVID-19 and has published the first conclusions today. The government said billions of items of PPE were delivered to NHS staff and it would learn lessons from the inquiry. The Royal College of Psychiatrists has produced new guidance for healthcare professionals on how to recognise and manage people with eating disorders who are dangerously ill. It says too many young people have died in the UK from anorexia, bulimia and binge eating when their lives could have been saved. More details from our health reporter, Philippa Roxby.
The pandemic has made an already growing problem of eating disorders even worse, particularly in younger age groups. The latest NHS figures for England show there were 11,000 more hospital admissions for these conditions last year compared with 5 years before. The updated guidance is aimed at all healthcare staff and contains a traffic light system for assessing risk in patients of any age, advice on treatment and how to support their families. The eating disorder charity Beat said services were already under prolonged strain. It hopes the guidance will reduce the risk of preventable deaths.
The number of cases of monkeypox identified in the UK this month has risen to 9 after 2 more people were confirmed to have the virus. It's believed that the most recent infections were picked up in Britain and aren't linked to travel overseas. Cases have recently been detected in Spain, Portugal, Canada and the United States, but experts say that the chance of infection is still low. A new super nature reserve is being created, spanning large parts of Somerset and an area which is home to many rare and threatened species. It marks the 70th anniversary of the creation of the country's first nature reserve. More details from our environment correspondent, Helen Briggs.
Somerset's spectacular landscape, a mosaic of rivers, wetlands, heaths and moors, is home to an array of rare wildlife, from birds such as the skylark to water voles, bats and dragonflies. Now 6 nature reserves and other land around the Somerset levels, coast and moors are being merged to create what's billed as a Supernational nature reserve. It is England's second after Purbeck Heaths in Dorset. The idea is to better manage the landscape for nature and the climate, including restoring low-lying peatlands that can trap millions of tons of carbon.
Helen Briggs reporting.
Thanks very much, Chris. It is 6 minutes past 6. Let's get our first look at the weather today with Sarah Keith-Lucas at the BBC Weather Centre. Good morning, Sarah.
Good morning to you, Simon. Well, some people will have had quite a disturbed night's sleep because we've had thunderstorms and really frequent lightning that have been pushing across central, southern and eastern parts of England. They should be clearing away towards the east over the next few hours, so we are looking at a predominantly dry day ahead with some warm sunshine, just a few more showers pushing into the northwest. But let's start with the detail first across the southeast of England, because we've still got some of those sharp showers around, and over the next few hours we'll continue to see a few rattling through, particularly through parts of Kent, Sussex, perhaps a few for Surrey and Essex as well. They should clear by about the middle of the morning, but they have left behind quite a lot of mist and some dense fog patches in 1 or 2 places as well. Clearing up goes through the day, so lots of warm sunshine by this afternoon, and that's going to lift temperatures to around 20 to 23 degrees here. For the rest of England, away from the southeast and for Wales, we have got some mist and murk around this morning. That should clear away reasonably quickly, and then long spells of sunshine and blue sky, just a little fair weather cloud bubbling up this afternoon, but temperatures around 17 to 20 degrees. And for Scotland and Northern Ireland, we're looking at a largely dry day ahead. Just a few showers in the far northwest, but with a fern effect, it's going to feel quite warm out there today, with top temperatures here around 17 to 20 Celsius.
Sarah, thank you. 6:07 is the time. Let's have a first look at the papers and the news websites. And the Daily Mirror says roaring inflation is causing untold misery and the poorest are hit the hardest. The charity Citizens Advice is highlighting desperate stories, the Mirror says, of people washing in their kitchen sinks because they can't afford a hot shower. It's impossible. Pensioners can't cope with 9% inflation is the main headline in the Daily Express. The paper's calling for urgent help for pensioners. The Silver Voices group, which campaigns on behalf of people over the age of 60, warns that thousands could die because they can't afford the essentials for a healthy life.
According to the Daily Mail, the government is considering a triple tax cut. One of them was announced by Mr. Sunak, who said he'd reduce tax of firms to prompt them to invest. He might also announce in July a council tax cut to help people pay higher energy prices. According to the paper, an emergency tax cut for poorer families is also being considered, possibly through a change to universal credit rules. The former Conservative Chancellor Lord Clark tells the Independent website that Mr. Sunak's measures so far have failed to help the poor while rewarding the better off. Ken Clark described the 5p fuel duty cut and a promised 1p reduction in income tax as a complete waste of time. He said Mr. Sunak should increase universal credit.
The Times says it's learned that Number 10 is blocking proposals for a windfall tax on energy companies. The paper says Rishi Sunak is increasingly in favour of the levy and Treasury officials believe it's politically unavoidable. But Boris Johnson's advisers argue that the tax would be ideologically unconservative because it could be seen as an attack on business.
The Chief Inspector of Constabulary, Andy Cook, has told The Guardian that the cost of living crisis will trigger an increase in crime and offences. He said officers should use discretion when deciding whether to prosecute people who steal in order to eat. Mr. Cook insisted he wasn't giving carte blanche for people who go out shoplifting.
The Daily Telegraph warns middle-class and recreational drug users that they could be banned from going on foreign holidays. Writing in the paper, the policing minister, Kit Malthouse, says those who continue to flout the law would face increasingly painful and escalating sanctions, with the paper suggesting those could include a temporary removal of passports or driving licences. Details of the proposals are going to be in a white paper to be published in the summer.
The Sun says the footballer Jamie Vardy and his wife Rebecca are planning to move to the US after her libel trial against Colleen Rooney, who's married to the former England captain Wayne Rooney. The paper says it describes Mrs. Vardy's case as disastrous, says she and her husband want to leave the UK, whatever the outcome of the trial.
And finally, the Times urges men to hug their wives and girlfriends in the morning before they rush out of the front door. The paper says scientists in Germany and the Netherlands have found that an embrace at this time helps protect women from feelings of stress that might develop during the day.
6:10. Now, earlier this week, the Governor of the Bank of England apologised in advance for being apocalyptic in his comments. In some parts of the world, there will be serious shortages thanks to the conflict in Ukraine, with serious consequences. Simon Jones is our reporter, and is here with me in the studio. What's Mr. Guterres been saying?
Well, it's a pretty stark warning from Antonio Guterres, who's talking about potentially we're facing a global food crisis. And I think one thing the war in Ukraine has demonstrated is just how dependent the world is on Ukraine for its food. Now, before the war, Ukraine exported 12% of the world's wheat, 15% of the world's corn, 50% of sunflower oil. But since the war, those exports have pretty much collapsed. Now, we've seen the consequences here in the UK, for example, with food prices going up, and also if you go into supermarkets, you may be rationed the amount of sunflower oil you're allowed to buy. But according to the UN, the consequences for poorer countries could be far, far worse. Antonio Guterres talks about potentially years of mass hunger for poorer countries, famine for millions, unless Russia releases grain that's currently being stored in Ukrainian ports for export. And at this UN summit in New York, Russia has been accused of weaponizing the global food supply chain. And Germany even accused Russia of launching a grain war.
And of course, when we saw food shortages and very high food prices a few years ago, that they were generally explained as one of the big causes of the Arab Spring. So presumably the consequence of this could be things like civil unrest.
I think that is a real concern amongst world leaders. We've had the World Food Programme talking about the potential destabilisation of nations. It could cause mass migrations. Now, the World Bank has put an extra £40 million to try to fight extreme poverty and food insecurity this year. But the message from the UN is there is enough food in the world right now if countries act together. But they say this problem needs solving right now. It needs solving today. And the UN's actually trying to establish establish food corridors. It basically wants Russia to allow some of this grain and other food products to be exported. It also wants fertilizer produced by Russia and Belarus also to be exported as well. The UN says it's in intense contact with Russia, but it says it needs goodwill on all sides, and that can be difficult to find.
Joe, thanks very much indeed there. Simon Jones, our reporter. Thanks, Simon.
It is 13 minutes past 6. Let's turn to the war itself now. It's been claimed that Ukraine has killed a Russian civilian with a shell fired into Russia. Joe Inwood's our correspondent in Lviv. What do we know, Joe?
So this is a border town around the city of Sumy. This is an area which was subject to a Ukrainian counteroffensive all the way back to the border. This was, at the start of the war, this was one of the areas that the Russians invaded on, and they have now taken the territory all the way back to the border. We don't really have more information as to whether this was a deliberate shelling across the border, or it was a shell that has overshot a border post. It's not really certain, but they say it hit an alcohol factory. I think what's interesting here is the increased reports we're seeing of the war getting onto Russian territory itself. Of course, we've seen over the last few weeks and months reports, often unconfirmed, of Ukrainian attacks, Ukrainian helicopter attacks, drone strikes even, deep into Russian territory on oil depots, on refineries and on logistics hubs. So this is just another example of how the war which Russia started and intended to carry out exclusively on the territory of its neighbour, it is now sneaking back into the territory of the Republic itself.
Meanwhile, inside Ukraine, an extension to martial law.
Yeah, absolutely. Another 90 days of martial law. This was something that was put in place by President Zelensky at the start of the conflict, and it allows essentially continued mobilization, and it allows the economy to be operated on a war footing. It does need to be confirmed by Parliament, but I think that can be assumed that will go through as they continue their war efforts.
And also strong words from President Zelensky. I suppose you would expect them, but nonetheless strong words when it comes to the Russian military effort, and particularly the use, as they claim now, of a new form of weapon.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a rather bizarre one. He accused the Russians of using what he called a Wunderwaffe, a reference to the German attempt to find a wonder weapon in the Second World War, and he's talking about lasers. Now, the Russians often reveal these sort of secret military projects, and they did this one in 2019, a laser reportedly capable of taking down the site of blocking a satellite or taking down drones, and apparently they are now using them in the war. It was announced yesterday by the Russian Deputy Prime Minister in charge of weapons development that they were using these lasers, taking down drones at 5 kilometers. President Zelensky mocked them rather for this and said it was a sign of the fact they're running out of conventional weapons and they're running out of ideas. Obviously, the Russians would have a very different picture, I'm sure, and they often demonstrate their high-tech arsenal as a sign of their military prowess.
Joe Inwood in Lviv, thank you.
Now, the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, says the next few months will be tough. That's what he told a group of business leaders last night. What can he do, though, to ease the price pressures for businesses and households? Sean Farrington has been taking a look at this and the rest of the morning's business news. Morning, Sean.
Morning, Simon. Question of the moment, isn't it? Chancellor Rishi Sunak reiterating last night his view that no law the government can pass to solve the problems we're facing exists, and he said that to the CBI's annual dinner last night, calls for cuts to taxes like VAT to raise benefits, introducing a windfall tax, energy bills, discounts and more. There's calls from those from all corners, but which to go for, if any? Well, one person who's had to help make those decisions in the past is economist Rupert Harrison, former advisor to George Osborne when he was Chancellor in the aftermath of the credit crunch. He's now at BlackRock as a portfolio manager. Morning, Rupert.
Good morning.
So what would you be telling the Chancellor to do now, and how quickly?
Well, I think he needs to act. I think he knows that. I think he's going to do that relatively soon and in relatively large scale, I would have thought. As you just said, there's nothing he can do to magic away the inflation problem. That's going to take some time, but he can act to help people with their incomes, and I think he could particularly do that. The one thing the government can do that sort of helps people with their incomes and directly addresses the inflation problem is cut VAT, and I think that is quite likely. So I think a temporary VAT cut has a precedent. Alistair Darling did it in the financial crisis. It helps with supporting incomes, and it directly reduces inflation. And I think we should be just as worried about the risks of recession in the UK over the next 12 months as we are about inflation, and a VAT cut would help address both. But I think he also will want to help people on lower incomes, particularly through universal credit, and I suspect we'll also see more direct help for energy bills, as we saw through the previous package.
How big a cut in VAT should there be?
Well, look, that is the big call. The Treasury, I think, is still reeling from the pandemic, where they, I think very effectively had to spend a huge amount of money, and I know they are still very concerned about the long-term future of the public finances, and that's the judgment they've got to make about whether this is enough of a kind of short-term economic crisis to go big. I mean, I think that 2.5% cut in VAT is still a very big tax cut and still very expensive to the Treasury. I think that would have a decent impact on inflation, so that would be my expectation, but it's not impossible that they could do more than that.
What about the argument that it can almost add fuel to the fire? It might reduce prices in the short term, but actually by the government spending a lot of money and cutting taxes can actually stoke inflation itself?
Yeah, look, I think that there are circumstances where that is true, and I think the US economy probably looks a bit like that, where you've got a labour market that's extremely tight, you've got wages growing extremely fast, and I think in the US economy a kind of big fiscal loosening probably could do more harm than good. I don't think that is the case in the UK. First of all, I don't think we've got the same kind of hot labour market yet quite in the UK as we do in the US. Also, the European economy, I think, is already slowing very dramatically because of the scale of the energy price shock here in the UK and in Europe, which is just bigger than it is in the US. So I think in Europe and the UK we have more of a growth problem, and therefore I think the right response is a fiscal loosening right now. I don't think that is going to trigger the kind of inflationary problems that would be self-defeating.
So fiscal loosening from the government's decisions. What about monetary policy decisions from the Bank of England? I mean, do you agree with many who think too slow to raise rates and they need to raise them more?
Not really. I have a lot of sympathy for the Bank of England because I think this inflation is largely externally driven, and there's not a huge amount that monetary policy can do to address that. I think they've been right to bring monetary policy up closer to neutral levels. They've removed the kind of active stimulus they were applying to the economy. I think they are now quite close to that neutral level, and I think that they should go relatively cautiously from here. Of course, if they see the Treasury responding with a fiscal loosening, it's possible that will encourage them to do a little bit more. But as I say, I think their forecast was, I think, refreshingly honest. They forecast sort of significant growth risks in the UK, and I suspect that over the next 12 to 18 months that slowing growth will do most of their work for them in terms of putting a lid on the inflation problem.
Rupert Harrison, thank you. BlackRock's portfolio manager, former advisor to George Osborne. Listening to that was Jane Foley, head of foreign exchange strategy at the Dutch bank Rabobank. Morning, Jane.
Good morning.
What would investors make of the government making some of those decisions Rupert Harrison suggesting there?
Well, I think investors would assume that if the government were going to have more fiscal policy outlays, then interest rates would go up more, and that in the short term would push sterling up as well. And this is the danger right now. The UK, if you like, is sandwiched between the US and Europe in terms of the risk. So we have some of the energy price risk that Europe has in terms of higher gas prices, etc. And we also have some of the wage inflation that the US have. In Europe, its wage inflation is quite low. And this puts the UK economy perhaps in the worst of both worlds sort of position. Now, if we were to have further fiscal outlay, it would mean that maybe the market would think, oh, you know what, the Bank of England has to go up more with interest rates. And that, of course, could mean that the inevitable slowdown that we get could be even harder.
Are you able to make comparisons to how inflation is in the UK versus the rest of the world or other similar countries at the moment? I just wonder whether the pound itself tells us anything about the UK economy.
right now, the inflation in the UK is the worst, really, in the G7, at 9%, and certainly up there. It's certainly higher than in the Eurozone, although they have inflationary issues too. In fact, inflationary issues are just about everywhere, and this is of course because of the common issues associated with food prices. But they don't have quite so much of the gas issue that we have in Europe, in the US, but they are having higher petroleum prices, and actually they're running out of diesel, which is a real issue as well. So there are inflationary problems everywhere, but it is particularly poor in the UK right now. And of course, some of the supply chain issues that we have are arguably worsened by Brexit as well. So a lot of issues for the UK economy.
Jane, the ruble. A month ago when we were talking about it, we were talking about how it was back to where it was before this latest Russian invasion of Ukraine. Now it's even stronger. It's stronger than it's been for 2 years. Why is that?
Well, actually, we had a little bit of loosening in ruble this week, and that was because the central bank could see that the ruble had reclaimed some of its gains and loosened the capital, or some of the capital controls. So now, if you were a Russian or if you were in a friendly nation, you can take more money out of the country than you could previously. And of course, that explains, these capital controls explains one of the main reasons why the ruble is at the rate it is, relatively strong compared with at the start of the war. It's not a true market. You are banned, if you're Russian, from selling a lot of rubles. So if all of those measures, those capital controls, were to be taken away, if a lot of US, Western countries were able to go through and sell some of the ruble holdings, some of the businesses that they want to sell, I think we would be looking at a completely different picture.
Jane, thank you. Jane Foley, Head of Foreign Exchange Strategy at Rabobank. Some of those concerns about the US economy, Jane talking about they're reflected in US stock markets closing last night. The S&P 500 closing down 4%, the Nasdaq nearly down 5%. Today, here in the UK, it's the AGM of the retailer Next. There's going to be a vote, amongst other things, on the Chief Executive Lord Wolfson's pay. It was up 50% last year to £4.4 million. Shareholder advisors, the Institutional Voting Information Service, have suggested investors should vote against that deal. It's the latest in a series of AGMs where executive pay is under pressure. And the Church of England Pension Board is a Next shareholder. Will be voting at the AGM today. Its Chief Responsible Investment Officer, Adam Matthews, joins me now. Morning, Adam.
Morning.
How will you vote on that pay today?
Well, we're voting against it, and we feel that, like a number of the pay packages that are coming to vote, that there's just excess in the system. There has been a period of restraint during COVID, but unfortunately that doesn't seem to be translating through to a lot of the votes that we're being asked to take a position on. And along with Next, you saw yesterday JP Morgan, where there was a $52 million payout to their CEO on top of his $34 million pay package.
That's a bit different, though, isn't it, to a £4.5 million pay packet, which I know is still a lot of money in itself.
Yeah, no, indeed, and there is a difference in some of the sort of the levels of excess that you're seeing in the US versus the UK. But that's not to say that there haven't been instances in the UK where you've seen that kind of level of very significant pay awards going to executives. And when you look at the sort of cost of living crisis that you've got enormous pressure on many of the workers in these sort of consumer-facing industries. A lot of them aren't necessarily on the living wage, and you then see the executives rewarding themselves. And the system at the moment, to be honest, is broken in executive pay.
I mean, you say executives rewarding themselves. There's your remuneration committees, there's shareholders who've signed off in the past on how all this pay is worked out. Next, if we take as an example today, a lot of people think has done well coming out of the pandemic and has been a success story on the high street over decades. Does the chief executive not deserve that pay for that?
Well, I think, of course, there's that balance to be struck between an executive leading a company that's doing well, but at the same time, when that company is not necessarily a living wage accredited employer, and also has been reliant on bailouts from the UK government during the sort of COVID period, which we completely understand why lots of companies take that. I think moving to increasing bonuses and pay awards before you've actually fully paid back everything you've taken from the state is concerning to investors. But there's a general wider problem here. You've got rebellions of shareholders voting 69% against pay awards. You had that at Tesco last year. You had that at JP Morgan in the US, and yet what actually changes as a result of that? Very little. I mean, in JP Morgan, you basically had a statement from the company saying, well, we'll come, we'll engage with investors, we'll listen, but the pay package and the award still went through. So as a system, it's not working. There's been an element of restraint, but that isn't applied across all the boardrooms, and the directors that are responsible for remuneration aren't really sort of holding back in the way that we need them to. So therefore, I think investors, asset owners, pension funds in particular, need to really look at this system, because it isn't working, and you have got excess. You had MBIM on your programme saying that there's corporate greed, and there appears to be so we need to take action.
The Norway Sovereign Wealth Fund we were speaking to earlier in the week. Adam, thank you. Adam Matthews, Chief Responsible Investment Officer at the Church of England Pension Board. After 7, I'm going to be talking to the boss of EasyJet, seeing how that company has been getting on with fuel prices high, but passengers coming back.
Sean, thank you. 27 minutes past 6. The streets of Glasgow, where I am this morning, were pretty silent in the middle of the night. I suggest that they would have been less silent had things gone better in Germany. Here's Gary.
Yeah, you're spot on. How late were you out on the streets with those
Well, put it this way. It wasn't all night.
Thought not. You're spot on. It proved to be a heartbreaking night for those Rangers fans, because they were beaten 5-4 on penalties in the final of the Europa